Sam Wade. So it's all going on in the breakouts. Breakout sessions 3 and 4 will then begin at 1:25. In room 7, the Chief Technology Officer for HM Government, Liam Maxwell, will give a talk with Director of Design at Government Digital Service, Ben Terrett, entitled Users First, Managing Cybersecurity Risk. And at that same time, room 11, we'll be highlighting the best of London's tech startups. 2 of London's up-and-coming entrepreneurs, Tushkar Agarwal, the co-founder of Hubble, and Jennifer Arcuri, the founder of the Innertech Summit, will give you a glimpse into their very pioneering companies and talk about the London tech scene as it's going on here. Please consult your lanyards for the map if that's all highly complicated, but do get to those breakouts and don't forget to have lunch. Without more ado, let's welcome our next panel to the stage. We're going to be looking at market matters, and the spotlight is now on the global economy. So can I call to the stage the CEO of PIMCO and the current Chief Economic Advisor to Allianz, Mohamed El Erian, the Chairman of Rabini Global Economics, Dr. Noura Rabini, and former Chair of the US President's Council of Economic Advisors and current Professor of Business Administration and Economics at the Berkeley House School of Business, Dr. Laura Tyson. A warm welcome to my next guest. No special order, just come and have a seat. Laura, you take the middle. Okay. And if we can go back to where Jeremy left off, or perhaps where Jeremy started, I'll come to you, Mohamed El Erian. This idea of capitalism sharing the stage with its economic offspring, the sort of sharing economy, what does that do to the market?
So fundamentally, we are going through a major transformation, and it's the same theme when you look at markets and the economy that you've heard before, which is we're going from a distribution of potential outcome that is bell-shaped with one potential outcome, tails but thin, to a much more bifurcated, bimodal distribution. That's the theme you've heard over and over again, and it's the theme that you're going to hear, I suspect, certainly from me and maybe from others. So think of it in the following way. When you bring all this together, you are a teacher, and you're told the good news is that the average quality of your class this year is higher. So your immediate reaction is, wow, that's great, because they'll be easier to teach, they'll be easier to engage. And then you thought, but wait a minute, while the average is higher, the composition is more dispersed. The good are getting better. Those who are struggling will struggle even more. The middle is being hollowed out, and you've got a few wild cards. That is what you've heard this morning. That's what it implies for the economy. So look over the next few years, growth will pick up at the global economy. Why? Because those countries that are doing well will do better. United States, India, the UK. The middle will be basically China stabilizing at a 6.5% to 7% growth rate, a soft landing. At the other end, countries like the Eurozone, in the Eurozone, Japan, Brazil will face pretty difficult challenges. And then you have the wild cards, those in the classroom that can really disrupt everything. The Greece, the Russia, the Venezuelas of this world. That is what it translates to, and it fundamentally means a different way of doing things in the marketplace, in companies, and in governments.
And is that something, Noura Rabini, you're embracing?
Well, there are things that are happening, and we cannot avoid them from happening. In addition to the trend that Mohamed spoke about, I think there are several other ones that are going to affect the global economy. One is ongoing for the last decades, is more trade and globalization, and that has led to offshoring of jobs from advanced economies to emerging markets. That has led to an increase in incomes in emerging markets, but it also led to a hollowing out of jobs in advanced economies, jobs or wages. And it's not just anymore blue-collar jobs, because now also many services given technology are becoming tradable. So, radiologists in Mumbai today can do the same job as a radiologist in New York for 1/4 of a salary, and of course the call centers in Bangalore or in Manila can do those kind of jobs and so on. That's one trend. The other trend is that a lot of technological optimism. Of course, here we hear about all these innovations, whether it is energy technologies or biotechnologies or information technologies or manufacturing technologies, the Internet of Things, the sharing economy. There'll be probably over time, massive increases in productivity, even if in the data we don't see those increases in productivity. Maybe is a lag, like in the first digital revolution, between innovating and eventually having the productivity increases. But in the question mark is not on whether there'll be massive increase in productivity, but who are going to be the gainers and the losers. And one of the aspects of technology today is that it's increasingly capital intensive, skill bias, and labor saving not just low income and low skill jobs, but also semi-skilled jobs, and not just traditional blue collar jobs, but also white collar jobs. So owners of physical and financial capital are going to do well. Those of us who are innovators and creators and entrepreneurs are going to do well. But the question of where are going to be the jobs and or the wages of semi-skilled or unskilled blue collar and white collar workers is going to be an issue. And that leads to the next step, that is this rise of inequality, whether it's driven by trade and globalization, whether it's driven by this technological innovation that are labor saving and skill bias and capital intensive, whether it's driven by the fact that the economic and financial elites appropriate more of the gains, call it monopoly capitalism, whether it's driven by winner take all effects, right? If you're the superstar in your own field, you get most of the gains of those innovations. That's a trend. And it's a trend that eventually is going to be one leading to social and political instability, but this also redistributes income from those who have a higher marginal propensity to spend to those have a higher marginal propensity to save, and that's going to be disruptive of economic growth. So those are trends that you have to think about.
And Laura Tyson, I wanted to bring you in on this idea of inequality that Nouriel's setting out there. Mm-hmm. The vision that Jeremy left us with was this labor-intensive social economy. It will all come good in the end because there will be these jobs, whether it's in blue-collar manufacturing for fitting the solar bits or, reforming the energy sector, or in the jobs that machines simply can't do. Is that our panacea? Is that where it's all going to come right?
I think I will answer that question, but I want to answer it in the context of the now and what we've seen over time. I don't think like Jeremy in 40 or 50 year increments. It's hard for me to do that. So the vision of what is true of 50 years, I tend to think, well, what do we know that's happened, and how can we project that forward? So to get to inequality, in the past 30 years, we've been focusing today so far on increasing inequality. That's something I worry a lot about. That's a very profound problem in the United States and in many developed countries. One should note at the same time this was happening, global inequality as measured by countries was actually going down, and we have made the tremendous unanticipated success of the Millennium Development Goals at reducing significantly absolute poverty around the world. And very much, I would agree with whoever said it this morning, we're in reaching distance of actually eliminating that around the world in the next 15 to 20 years. So I want to start with, let's put this in the context. I want to put it in context also by therefore noting that in thinking about these problems, or challenges or opportunities, someone mentioned this morning, it's important to think of the context. Countries have handled this and will continue to handle this differently. So I love the concept of EIEIO, that basically the technology may drive all societies towards increasing inequality over the next 40 to 50 years, but societies have lots of choices to make to deal with that in education, in immigration, in infrastructure. And I would like to point out a society that hasn't been mentioned here at all today so far, at least not that I've heard, and that is China. Think of China versus the US in the last 2 decades, and think about their investments in infrastructure, their investments in education, their investments in creating the engineers to populate the factories that are developing and producing this modern technology to be deployed around the world. That has been a massive EIEIO strategy, not all of elements, but right? Whereas I would say Europe, no. The US, no. Okay, so there are ways in which one can handle this. That's about the politics, that's about the trade-offs. I'll mention one other thing that was mentioned this morning. In thinking about, Jeremy did mention this. He talked about, okay, if we're going to have this massive infrastructure development, and I hope we do, because like him, I think the giant in the room is climate change, and if we can talk about technology all we want, but if the technology is not addressing that, technology is adding to that, we're creating our own tombstone. We're creating our own tombstone. We're making ourselves very sophisticated to go into the grave. So in the area of technology and the environment and climate change, that is massive infrastructure that is led by policy. Notice when Jeremy was talking about it, he was talking about government policy. He was talking about what Germany is doing in the area of policy to create a green technology. So I definitely think that there are ways that societies have to take advantage of the tremendous opportunities of technology, and we heard about those from Jeremy, particularly in climate change. And they also have to deal with the downsides, which are the inequality. They're both there, and there are policy measures that can be taken. Let me just throw out another set of European countries, because I think in listening to the conversation this morning, I mentioned China, hadn't been mentioned. There was a lot of talk about a social safety net this morning and how when you have very rapid technological change, you need a safety net which mobilizes the labor force. You need labor force support mechanisms. What about the Nordic countries? Maybe they actually have the social safety net policies to make their labor markets flexible. They certainly have the social safety market policies to mobilize their female labor force, which is certainly part of this. So maybe we should look around the world and say, okay, where are some things we can learn about practices countries can take to take advantage of the opportunities, develop the infrastructure, Internet of Things, and at the same time address the inequalities? So.
I'm very conscious. I don't want to, we've got some brilliant guests, brilliant panelists, and I don't want to hog them. So if there are questions, we've got roving mics, catch my eye. We can bring people in now if there are some questions before we go on. You, sir, let's just get a mic here. Anyone else that I'm missing? There's a hand at the back. Yeah, if we just get two mics here.
Catherine Bennell from the New York Times. I would be interested to hear some thoughts on how to reform the taxation system. What I'm hearing is that we are moving from a very from a system where most of the taxation income we get today come from labor sources. At the same time, you know, we are moving to a more capital-intensive economy. So if we keep taxing labor, we're probably reinforcing the problem of seeing fewer people in productive and well-paid jobs. So the question is there a point in possibly moving some taxation onto capital? And if so, how to do that in a globalized world where capital is very mobile?
Really interesting. I'm just going to take your question before we go to you, sir.
Yes, I'd like to hear a lot more about the financial markets and how you all three see them developing in the near future, and those effects on capital for small and medium enterprises and large established firms, given the size of the financial markets as a part of GDP in most Western economies.
Great. Shall I let you, Nouriel, do the second bit, the financial markets? And I'm going to go to you first, if I have Mohammed, to look at taxation systems. Is it right for reform now, given that the money's not coming from the same place?
So, if you allow me, the two questions are critical because they speak to recognition of issues. And I think the really exciting thing right now is there's broad-based recognitions of the challenges we're facing. That wasn't the case coming out of the global financial crisis. I remember when this notion of the new normal was introduced, it was called idiotic. Today it's called secular stagnation, the new mediocre. Right? There's recognition about taxation, but we collectively have tied our hands in terms of responses. So while there's recognition, there isn't responses. The only way we've tried to respond is by artificially using financial markets, by artificially boosting asset prices in order to trigger an economic response that would then validate the asset prices. That's what central banks have been doing, not by choice, but by necessity, because what we talked about earlier, the political system isn't responding properly, neither on tax reforms, nor on infrastructure, nor on labor market reforms, nor on aggregate demand, nor on debt. It's simply not responding, and the institutions aren't responding. So if I may, Emily, one thing that I think is important is why aren't we making the right choices? Okay, we all say this is not destiny, this is about choices, but we haven't made the right choices. And what strikes me, it's a lot more than just politics and institutions. And this is where behavioral science is really important. It's about how we function when we're out of our comfort zones. And whether you're a household, whether you're a government, whether you're a company, you're going to have to get much better about recognizing your blind spots, about recognizing your unconscious biases, about promoting gender diversity, about communicating a lot more and a lot better about using scenario analysis rather than become a hostage of a belly of a curve that no longer exists. And finally, and importantly, you're going to have to develop optionality, the ability to evolve as things change, which is this combination of resilience and agility. So a really important thing in these 2 days is to understand how it's not just about politics, it's not just about institutions, it's about how we ourselves change the way we think, how we think, in order to deal with these bimodal distributions that are fundamentally discomforting for us.
If I could add something about the financial system, I think that one of the things that happened in the last decades has been increasing frequency of financial crises that have been associated with excessive build-up of debt and leverage, both in the private and public sector. And the question is why there has been such an increase in debt. And I think that links again to the issue of inequality. In a world in which trade, globalization, technology leads to inequality, stagnation of average income, as was pointed out earlier this morning, solutions have been either in Anglo-Saxon countries, unquote, access to credit, so the household can borrow more than their income and spend over their incomes, or in the case of European economies, provision of public services and transfers that are not paid by taxation, and it leads to a rise in budget deficits of the public sector. So I think that the rise of debts in the private and public sector is not totally unrelated to the stresses that come from rising inequality, stagnation of wages, stagnation of jobs, that then leads to this financial crisis. So unless we address these fundamental issues, we're going to see more of these crises over and over again. And 6 years after the financial crisis, level of private and public debt as a share of GDP in advanced economies are as high as ever, actually higher than before the financial crisis.
Can I just say something on the tax issue? Because two points. Number one, I mentioned the Nordic countries. It's very interesting to look at pre-tax transfer income inequality and post-tax transfer income inequality, and note that the Nordic countries have a lot of VATs and a lot of tax on labor. But their post-tax and transfer inequality is much reduced, because it depends not just how you tax, but when you spend the money on. Okay, so I think if you're spending the money on education, you're spending the money on family support, you're spending the money on research, you're spending the money on labor market flexibility, the same tax structure can generate a lot of revenue and a lot less inequality. So I think that's just an important point. The second point on the taxation of capital, I do think that there is work at the OECD level, and it has been mentioned here on the stage by others, that as the world moves aggressively towards intangible capital, and intangible capital is mobile, and we know that intangible capital has moved dramatically to places where its taxation rate is very, very reduced. I think there is no other solution to that than a multilateral solution. And I hope that the OECD can move forward on this. One of the things that's happening, of course, in all of this is the pace of technology is moving much faster than the policymakers can move. Yeah. Okay, much faster. So we can say, oh, well, policy can respond, but for a variety of reasons, policy is slow. So the OECD's recognized this as a problem. It's going to take some time to
But Laura, just talk us through, what would that look like? Because this isn't 40 years' time, this is kind of now. You're talking about a multilateral tax system that what crosses
It's essentially
boundaries?
the equivalent of what the OECD countries have started to do on individual taxes, which should go after individual incomes in tax havens. So everyone has to basically publish where their income is, where it's coming from, and then there are decisions about the level on which it would be taxed. So you could say a resident, the way they're doing this with individuals is your resident home matters to where you pay at least some of your taxes, not just where you put all of your income, which was not clear. So they're doing that at the individual basis. At the corporate basis, it would be something like that. So I honestly think the UK is a really interesting case here, because the UK has aggressively moved to the bottom in terms of corporate tax of intangible assets. They're with the patent box and 10%. On the other hand, they are part of the OECD effort to try to come up with some common rules about this. And I think that probably what you'd see is you'd see a reduction in the rates across the board, but you'd actually see in the areas that are more like just parking your money, tax havens, no real economic activity, just the income not being taxed, that there would be some agreement on
And
that.
this then would mean much less capital flight, much less movement.
That only means mobility of one thing, which is where you put your intangible assets. It doesn't really have to do, for tax purposes, it doesn't really have to do with where you put your real economic activity. And that's really the distinction that I think you were getting at with that question.
About the workforce, the movement of the workforce to find the right market, and I'm not talking about what we think of as whole-scale immigration so much as a socialist French government making London now the third biggest place for the French to come, if they're trying to store their, if they're trying to get away from the government regulations they don't like. I mean, are we into an area where that's going to be cracked down on, or is that, what do you think, is it going to be liberated?
So I think that's appreciated. Mo Ibrahim raised the point of global governance. Whether you look at the region or whatever globally, there are some, in a shared economy, the common goods become much more important, much more important. And you don't get there until first you fix your national politics, and the emergence of non-traditional parties is really shaking things up. That's the disruptor. That's the disruptor to politics. And secondly, you don't get there unless there's a common vision of why it is you need to do this, and it's in the benefit of everybody. So what she said about taxation, this is not an engineering problem. The engineering is simple.
No, it's simple. Yeah.
It's a political problem, right? And you somehow need to get people together. I have to tell you, there's someone who's been waving their hands, desperately trying to get your attention for a question.
Isn't it when I've got my back to you?
Yeah.
Let's get a couple of mics more, and
It's hard to
yes,
see.
a question here and a question there. Anyone I'm missing at the back of that side? Go for it.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for noticing me. I actually believe that policymakers could move faster than technology. The only issue is at the moment is education. We're seeing that there's a big gap between, I would say, more advanced economies who have invested heavily in education of computer science and engineering and the promotion of engineering across different backgrounds to try to get engineering more diverse within their own communities. What I find personally in the UK is that they've started being very, very aggressive in the positive sense in teaching children how to code. And this is what personally we're here for, both David and I. We're very, very focused here in the UK in trying to teach and reach as many people, girls and boys, teach them the fundamentals of engineering, coding, and electronics, because these will be the main drivers of tomorrow. What I've felt over the past discussions is that there's a big underlying assumption, both stated by Jeremy as well, is that we're requiring the population to make huge efforts in building an infrastructure by a population that's fundamentally not educated in technology. Unless we really, really change that assumption and create an educated workforce, only a small elite of super educated individuals will lead and continue to increase that wealth gap.
Okay.
I'm asking you, my question really is, what do you see as tools and policies that can change that over the world and also internally in countries?
You've said it, haven't you? The democratization of the education around technology.
Right.
I'm just going to leave that thought with you and go to you, Sir, so that we can deal with a couple of questions at the same time. Catch my eye if there's anyone else who's got something to come in on this.
Yes. Hi, good morning. My question is, on the one hand, we're seeing basically a global crisis in the capacity of governments to govern due to the accelerated pace of change. And at the same time, massive pressures and crisis on the level of the household. So my question is whether there is a middle intermediary level, which is the level of communities, where a lot of stuff can be addressed. We spoke about shared economy, but I'm speaking about actually rethinking about the structure of society as a network of communities and emphasizing that middle level. And my second question is, we're actually talking about the crisis of modern democracies and of capitalism at the same time. So again, how should we think about organizing ourselves moving forward when there's growing mistrust toward the economic system and the political system?
Okay. Nora, do you want to kick us off with that?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of education and the policy solutions, I think that it's just too easy to say everything's going to be resolved by education, innovation, entrepreneurship, immigration, and so on. And it's more difficult than that. First of all, immigration is a zero-sum game. If we get the smartest people from India and China and the US, they're losing them. So that cannot be the solution for everybody. Secondly, this world of in which everybody's going to become an innovator, an entrepreneur, I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen. You know, Keynes had this utopian view that because of technology, everybody's going to work 15 hours, we'll be all poets, artists, innovators. I think that's too utopian, frankly speaking. And on the question of education, you know, the question is many jobs that are white-collar jobs, that are college jobs, that are being substituted also, you know, by technology. As I said, today radiologists in Mumbai can do the same job as a radiologist in New York, but tomorrow there's a piece of software who can do it better and look in your x-rays than any radiologist around the world. So, and take Korea. In Korea, 70% of all students in high school go and get a college degree. There's such a glut of educated people, they don't have jobs. And the skill premium has actually collapsed significantly.
And is that what you think is going to happen? I mean, when you say that the utopia of the poets and the artists and all the rest of it won't exist.
One thing will be the opposite. It'll be those of us who are actually the innovator, entrepreneur, are going to still work 120 hours a week, and everybody else is not going to have any jobs and no incomes, and we'll have now to use taxation to give a living wage to those that don't have jobs and income. I think that's a more realistic work than the idea that everybody's going to be more productive, because there is a question of the distribution of the gains. Productivity is going to rise. Those who have capital, those who have skills are going to get the gains. Everybody else is going to lose. That's already the trend. We've seen the data that was showing this morning, that the share of labor is collapsing, and that's going to continue.
I know this is meant to be a focus on market matters, but this is the question that we keep coming back to. This sort of, 99% to the 1%, and the 99% do not have a future mapped out for them in this world.
Well, I think it's one of the brilliant lines in the McAfee Brilliance in a book, which basically, I'll paraphrase the line, which is, we're talking about capitalist societies right now. We could talk about other societies, and maybe we should. I mentioned how we might talk about China. But if we're talking about capitalist societies right now, basically the source of people's income and their life and their meaning in life is the labor market. It's the labor market. It's what we call the market. And if we believe, and this is where I'm with Nouriel, and I really worry, that the technology and the market together I don't see the change from what we've seen the last 30 years. The last 30 years are very, very clear in the developed countries, the large developed countries, and that is the erosion of the middle. And in the last decade, we not only had the erosion of the middle, the only place wages grew was at the top. The only place. And there was basically no employment growth at the top in the United States. There was just wage growth, a little bit of employment growth. All the employment growth that occurred, and it was weak for quite some time, was at the bottom. The middle class continued to erode. Tell me how that challenge is not going to continue. I think it's going to continue, and I think it's going to spread around the world because of the technology. So then the question is, what do you do about it? I do think there are things, so education, you'll help somewhat because you're giving some complementary skills to the technology to enhance people's capability. You're bringing down the wage premium so that the people at the top, who are the very rare people with the right engineering, there's more of them, and so their wage premium comes down, by the way. That's what happens, is that's how you get more equality, bring their wage premium down. But on education, I just want to point out, again, you see this very clearly in the United States, but elsewhere as well. We have the problem that inequality itself breeds educational inequality. It's very disturbing to see that in the United States, the gap in educational attainment level measured by income has gotten bigger, over time, okay? So you are much less likely to get the training to be a potential entrepreneur and giant in the engineering field if you are born into a low-income family than a high-income family. So if we're going to deal with education, it is actually a complicated challenge. It's not just, let's get a MOOC out there, okay? It's not that. It's basically, how do you start with a 3-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, give them the right vocabulary, give them the right networks, give them the right incentives. And when you have a lot of income inequality, it's getting bigger, you're going to have a much tougher problem dealing with education.
And Mohammed, I want to go back to your thought, which is it's about will. And there's almost, I don't know whether I'm, there seems to be a sort of latent guilt almost in the room that, this is the problem that's laid out, and yet there is, we're looking for solutions today, that's the thing. What is it then that shifts that the policy makers, the market makers not just the philanthropists, but changes the mindset if you think that that is the problem that needs to be sorted?
So I think it's two things, and this is where I agree and disagree with Laura. I think it's the recognition that we are on a certain path where we have stumbled, unfortunately, into a situation where structural, cyclical, and secular trends all contribute to growing inequality across the board. Not just an inequality of income, not just an inequality of wealth, but an inequality of opportunity, right? So I agree with you. Where I disagree is it will not go for 30 years, okay? If you look at the signals coming out of the marketplace, and I can tell you, a little signal that most people think it's noise, it's not. When you have a central bank like Switzerland that has devoted its whole existence to stability and predictability, this is our brand, and suddenly they do something that shocks everybody, this world is getting very hard to navigate. We are running it in an increasingly unstable mode. We are getting to what I call the T-junction, where we are going to tip in the next 3 to 5 years. We will tip. The current path we're on, where we rely on central banks to keep everything together, while the underlying forces are forcing bifurcation, that path is going to tip one way or the other. And that's where we get the choice. If we do nothing, we will tip into a world where not only do we have alarmingly high youth unemployment, a lost generation, no growth, more inequality, political dysfunction, but put on top of that, serious market instability. That's one way we could head. The other way is where you regain control through the political system, through what we do, and you get inclusive growth. You start structuring or anchoring the financial stability, no longer relying on central bank, but you actually anchor it in genuine financial stability, and you create the enabling environment for what I believe is truly there, which is micro innovations going macro in a fundamental way. That is the choice we face. I don't think we have 30 years. I think it's much. I think the T-junction is coming in the next 3 to 5 years.
And if you look at something like Greece, Greece made its decision. The markets didn't like that. What if the markets are wrong at this point? What if if you like, that popular voice is the one that will now control the markets, not the other way around?
Well, one of the things we're seeing, especially in Europe, is that the economic stagnation, the lack of jobs, the lack of wages, is now leading to political populism, right? The rise of extreme parties, not just of the left, like Syriza and Podemos, but of the extreme right, Le Pen, or in Italy, Lega Nord, and so on. And even in the United States, I think the manifestation of that is that many of the Tea Party supporters are those white underclass that in the US has been also disrupted by trade, technology, and globalization, and they're reacting against it. And the political manifestation of it is to be against trade, against globalization, against technology, against migrant, resource nationalism, trade protectionism, and imposing also capital controls on the flow of foreign direct investment. So unless we do something on providing economic opportunity to everybody, to deal with inequality, to create jobs, to create good jobs, to provide also social services, to have a social safety net, that backlash against globalization and market economy is going to get worse. We've seen it in Europe, we've seen it in the United States, we see it also in many emerging markets. Of course, in the Middle East, youth unemployment has led to revolution instability, but even in places like Asia, that is growing very fast, the question of inclusive growth is becoming a major issue, and there is a bit of a backlash against inequality in China, in India, in Indonesia, Malaysia, and throughout the world. So we have to find solutions to these problems.
I'm going to bring you in a second, Laura. I know you want to come in. Just let me see hands. Yes. We'll just get a mic here if we can. I can hear you, but maybe those at the back can't. Anyone else with a question to come on? We're sort of 5 minutes away from wrapping up, so do come with your questions if you've got a thought.
I keep hearing all day, all morning about the importance of creating growth and new economic models. What I'm not here is the impact of the economics of happiness and how that is part of creating this growth in the economy. Because technology is created by humans and is the reflection of the level of consciousness and where we exist. So if technology is going to be created for good or it's created for bad, will be the reflect of where we are. I'm not here about the importance of emotional intelligence development and personal development. Because whatever we do, we cannot change behavior, we cannot change what we are doing now if we don't shift the level of identity from which we operate. And that comes with the conversation this morning about redefining who we are as individuals in society. What is the society that we are, and what is the society that what we want to create, and what is the level of commitment of governments of making that happen. Because at the end of the day, every single country has the government that reflects the level of evolution of the citizens of that nation, and that's quite horrifying, what we see, the level of dictatorships, etc., that is throughout the world.
You're touching on a panel that's coming up tomorrow, so I don't want to sort of say too much on that. Who wants to take up on this?
Let me just, Ariana's going to speak about that tomorrow, and it's going to be a panel. To be provocative, and I agree with everything you've said, but without growth, without a sense that you not only have the ability to grow the pie, but redistribute the pie for the reasons we've heard today, of people getting disenfranchised increasingly, right? That is a necessary condition, but you're absolutely right, it is not sufficient. And we're going to hear a lot more tomorrow about why it's not sufficient.
No, I don't mean either or. I mean how you can bring both together. Because if we empower the individual, basically we need to build emotional resilience to be able to deal with things that they are not working.
Can I respond to that by saying I'm thinking about the very impassioned statement this morning, which I learned a lot from Philip Jennings. And he reminded us that half of the world's population doesn't really, of working age, does not have a quality job that's meaningful, okay? How can one ask the question, are we going to make people have emotional resilience to the fact that the technology and the economic growth may lead to jobs which actually do not provide a living standard which is consistent with the society in which they live? How can you give them resilience to deal with that? Or isn't the real question, how does society take its societal norms, which differ from society to society, the change in technology, and try to find policies to empower all of its citizens to have a living standard which is consistent with those norms? Why do we make it onto the individual to have the emotional resilience to deal with the breakdown of that? So I think it's fine to, where we see the most work going on in emotional resilience is companies that have huge amounts of rents, and how they share their rents with their workers is to give them all of the things from gyms to resilience to meditation to hours off to vacations, which are part of sharing their rents with their workers. I would rather see, and that's why I use the Nordic societies, I would rather see a society say, okay, well, there should be a minimum wage that is this relationship to the average wage, because there are a lot of people at any point in time who are going to be caught in the minimum wage. I want them to have a life which is consistent with my society's standards, therefore minimum wage. I want to make sure that I give people resilience tools through education. I want to make sure that I give people paid leave for their family. How can you be a resilient worker if you've got a sick person in your family and you don't have any societal support for you to deal with that? So societies can do a lot of things to help workers with resilience, and I would rather think about it that way.
I want to end on a couple of predictions, which follows on from what you're talking about. If I asked each of you in turn briefly to tell me where you think unemployment will be, what time span should we say? 10 years?
Unemployment rate, or?
Yeah, in terms of how much of the population of the country that you live in do you think will be unemployed, you know, under this, what Jeremy's called the third industrial revolution? Because that was a very positive sense of re-employment in a different guise, and it won't be shared by everyone, I'm guessing. Nora?
Well, I do worry, because for a long time after we lost job in manufacturing, we created tons of jobs in services, education, healthcare, government, financial services, transportation, retail. But this massive technological revolution now is occurring in services, right? Soon enough, we'll have a driverless car, and therefore all the Uber drivers are going to be gone, and we're not going to be driving. Even in education, why do we need 50,000 professors of economics, where you can have 100 of them, top one, having an online course, and you learn it, and everybody else is gone? Or in healthcare, as I said, tomorrow, a radiologist in Mumbai, along the one in New York, is going to be substituted by a piece of software who's going to do the job. Or look at retail. Now you have express checkout, you don't need all those tellers. And now there are robots that can actually restock the shelves. And increasingly it will be done by those guys rather than workers. Or Amazon is using right now robots for doing all the logistics of all their goods. And tomorrow they're going to use drones rather than UPS drivers to deliver the goods. So if you look across the board, there is a complete disruption that's coming, even in government. Eventually, e-government means we don't have all these public employees and so on. Or take financial services, where lots of back office staff is now going to Mumbai, and eventually it's going to be technology. So I think asking the question, where we're going to create jobs, what's going to be creation of technology, is very, very important. And if we don't do something about it, unemployment rates are going to surge throughout the world.
So I was looking through my notes. Someone said this morning it would be irresponsible for me to make this prediction, right?
Oh, go on then.
Okay. And the reason why is I truly believe we're coming to a T-junction where the probability of either outcome is similar. Now, what's interesting is it speaks to my point of how hard it is for us to think bimodally. Your question forces us back as if there's one scenario. Again, normal distribution, right? And I will push back. There isn't. It's a bimodal distribution, right? And we will tip one way or the other. So we're either going to return to a world where not only do we have low unemployment, but importantly, we have wages going up again. Or alternatively, we're going to tip in another world where we have lost generations. Not just a lost generation, but lost generations, right? And I find it very hard to average the two and tell you it's going to be that. It's, okay, because
and you're saying that depends on a policy decision or a societal decision, or what?
It depends on governments, on households, and on corporations. All three have the ability to influence the probabilities going on. Right now, we're letting markets influence that probability. That's what we're letting do. We're letting markets influence that, and markets are pursuing short-term profit maximization, not long-term, because they believe they can reposition themselves.
Laura, I'll let you have the last word. Do you think markets will, you talk about unemployment, but do you think markets will have less relevance to the world that we're living in?
So two things come to mind in that. One is to go back to something that Mohammed said at the very beginning and that I've emphasized too, and that is we can't really ask this question without thinking of particular places. So I think the employment outlook, the wage outlook, the development of the middle class outlook, the outlook for cars is very different in China and India. And let's face it, that's where a significant chunk of the world's population is. And that's where a significant chunk of the drivers of growth are going to be over the next, I'll only do 10 years out, okay? So while your T thing is not affecting them, that's about other parts of the world, I think. And so we have to think about that. And I think that the only other thing I would put into all of this is if Nouriel's sort of fears about technology are right, and I share those fears, so then it seems to me that societies that are based on labor markets as a way to generate livelihoods and meaning for people are going to have to come up with things like basic incomes, very generous minimum wage. In the US, it would be the earned income tax credit. You've got to figure out something to create enough income for people to have a meaningful life in your society as your society's norms define it. Otherwise, you get all of the political disruption that we're talking about. So that's how I would answer the question.
We're going to end it there, but thank you very much indeed. Mohammed El-Erian, Laura Tyson, and Noura Roubini. Thank you all very much indeed. Just a reminder then that the breakouts are beginning. 1 and 2 are beginning at 12:30, and it will restart here at 2:20. I'm talking to myself.